Chapter 11. Sally Stevens woke up promptly at daybreak the next morning. She was laying on her side, and she could see the eastern horizon through the drooping leaves of weeping willow trees outside the window. The long, slender leaves formed a delicate pattern against the framed backdrop of orange and crimson, and Sally made a picture out of the leaves as she lay very quietly without moving. She liked this moment at dawn each morning, before anyone or anything was astir for the new day. She always planned the things that lay ahead of her, mentally laying out the sequence of small things that needed to be done around the ranch. It gave her a good feeling to plan things ahead in an orderly fashion. It relegated the necessary tasks of the day to their orderly place in the scheme of things, and it was a daily source of satisfaction to Sally to know herself well able to take care of everything that lay ahead. This morning, a little feeling of trouble nagged at her as she lay half awake peering out the window. She couldn't think what it was, and she didn't know why she felt that way. She cautiously checked over the things that she had planned to do and found no cause of worry or alarm there. In her sleepy condition, it seemed to her everything was serene. She puzzled it over for a time and threw back the covers to get up. The men would be trooping in from the bunkhouse for breakfast soon, and she had best get started. As soon as she threw back the covers, she realized what had been subconsciously troubling her. The other side of the bed was empty. Pat wasn't there. Recollection of last night flooded back into her mind. How could she have forgotten? Ezra was in trouble, and Pat had ridden away into the night to do something about it. Right now, he might be in some terrible danger. She sat up on the edge of the bed, and her eyes were wide and frightened. Some hidden danger menaced the entire valley, and Pat had buckled on his guns at midnight and ridden off to fight against it. Her sense of security was shattered, and she trembled as she got up and started to dress. It was foolish of her, but she couldn't help it. She always felt like this when Pat was in danger. She knew he would come back unhurt. He always had. But she was frightened, and there wasn't anything to do about it. She tried to clear her mind of fear by thinking back to the daily routine that confronted her. There'd be 2 less mouths to feed at breakfast this morning. That meant only 1 skillet of ham and a half-dozen eggs less to prepare. She dressed swiftly and went out to the kitchen, where a fire was already laid in the cold range. That was one of Doc's tasks, the last thing he did each night before retiring. Sally struck a match to the fire and resolutely busied herself getting breakfast together. She beat up a pan of biscuits and slid them into the oven as soon as it was heated, and put the coffee on to boil, and got down a big home-cured ham from the hook in the pantry. She cut off a half-dozen thick slices and arranged them in 2 heavy iron skillets on the back of the stove, where they would cook slowly and remain juicy, and then went back to call out Doc. He was curled up in his own bed, with his face buried in a pillow and a blanket twisted and wrapped around his wiry young form. Sally hesitated by the side of the bed, with her hand outstretched towards his shoulder. For a moment, she was sorely tempted to let him sleep in this morning. It was going to be difficult to explain to him about Ezra and his father. Doc was wild about big, easy-going Ezra, and his thoughts that his father was the finest man on the earth. He wasn't going to understand why Pat had seemingly taken sides against Sam and Ezra last night and aid Trippo to lock Ezra up in jail. It was going to be a shock to the boy to learn that his father was no longer sheriff of Powder Valley. He was so young, Sally thought dismissively, so terribly young to try and understand these grown-up things. But she compressed her lips and took hold of his thin shoulder and gave him a shake. He was Pat's son, and he had to learn to face things. It wasn't right to shield him. Doc muttered something in his sleep and tried to twist away from his mother's hands. She stripped the blanket off of him, just as she did every morning, warning him sternly, "Breakfast is almost ready, son. You just hop up and get your face washed." "Aw, gee, Ma." Doc rolled over, protestingly screwing up his eyes against the bright morning light. "Can't I sleep in a little longer? I ain't hungry. Honest, I ain't." "Oh, you're always hungry," she reminded him briskly. "Roll out now. I have to get back to the kitchen." The biscuits were raisin nicely and beginning to show a faint tinge of gold on their flaky tops. The coffee was boiling and the slices of ham were starting to curl around the edges, sizzling gently and giving off a satisfying fragrance. Sally pushed the coffee back and then turned the ham. A tender little smile curled her lips as she recalled it was exactly at this moment every morning that Pat came into the kitchen for his first cup of coffee. He timed it exactly so that she was always turning the ham when he came in. He'd stop behind her and slip a hard forearm underneath her chin and tip her head back and kiss her forehead while she laughed and struggled futilely against him, waving the long tined fork hopelessly in the air. Her body arched for the feel of Pat's body back behind her and the sound of his voice asking cheerfully, "How's the coffee, old lady?" She blinked back threatening tears and finished turning the ham. Then she reached down a cup and poured out a cup of coffee just as though she was going to drink it companionably along with Pat as usual. She carried it back to the low rocking chair and sat down with it, but it didn't taste as good as usual. There wasn't the acrid smell of Pat's cigarette to go with it, and it wasn't seasoned by the early morning banter they always had with their coffee. For a moment, a terrible fear wrung in Sally's heart. Suppose Pat never came back. Suppose she had to go through the rest of her life, drinking a cup of coffee alone in the kitchen while she waited for the ranch hands to come in for breakfast. A tear splashed into the cup of coffee she held in her hand. She straightened up quickly as Doc's voice came from the doorway. "What's the matter, Ma? It looks like you're crying into your coffee. Where's Dad? Did you let him sleep in late?" "He isn't here," Sally told him composed. "Comb your hair and sit down at the table. I'm just going to be putting on the eggs." "Where is he, Ma?" Doc lingered in the doorway. "Ain't he come home from town? Was there trouble at the meeting last night, and where's Ezra?" "Comb your hair," Sally repeated firmly. She finished her coffee and got up to rinse the cup out. She lifted the tender slices of ham into a big platter and began breaking eggs into the sizzling grease. "Gee whiz, no one tells me nothing," Doc complained darkly. He hesitated a moment longer, but Sally's back remained turned, and the tantalizing odor of breakfast overcame his curiosity. He turned and hurried out to douse his hair in cold water and run a comb through the crisp black hair that was exactly like Pat's. Sally was setting breakfast on the table when Pete and the other two hands came in from the bunkhouse, and Pete said, "Morning, Miss Stevens," and then looked at the table with only 5 places set. Sally saw his glance, and she explained quickly, "Pat isn't here, and I guess you know about Ezra." "Yes, ma'am," Pete said solemnly. "We know all about Ezra, but I didn't know that you did." He cleared his throat and pulled out a chair to sit down. "Oh, yes," said Sally calmly. "Pat told me all about it." She looked at Pete lovingly with her chin lifted as though she challenged him to say something about the way that Pat had handled the situation in Dutch Springs. To her surprise, Pete said admiringly, "Well, Pat did all right, sure enough. Did him and Ezra ride by this way?" "Pat was alone. Don't you know that Ezra is in jail?" Doc came in just then. He stopped, stock still, and stared at his mother and said, "In jail? Ezra, how come?" "But he ain't," Pete put in. "Well, not no more, I mean. I reckon maybe you don't know all of it, ma'am," he went on gravely to Sally. "Pat must have rode out of here in a hurry to get his guns. We wondered how he pulled off a jailbreak without 'em." Sally bit her lip and sat down suddenly. A jailbreak?" Yes, ma'am. I reckon he didn't tell you what he planned on, but shucks, it ain't no secret now. I reckon everybody in the valley knows how Pat outsmarted Harlow by turning Ezra over for jailing and then slipped back and getting him out after Harlow and his new sheriff had just rode off, leaving 2 men to guard Ezra."
"Pat did that?" gasped Sally. "He went in and helped Ezra break out?"
"He sure did," Pete assured her with a wide grin. "He flabbergasted us, I tell you. We thought we was being smart when Sam Boyd and Salone and Mr. Withers all gunned up and went after Ezra. We found he was already gone and the 2 deputies tied up and mattered in wet hens."
"Are you sure it was Pat?" Sally demanded.
"I don't reckon nobody gonna say so out loud in company. He wore a mask and can't nobody prove 'twas him, but I don't know any other man in the whole valley that would have the guts to do it single-handed."
"Gee whiz, no one tells me nothing," groaned Doc. "What happened, Pete? What about Ezra getting arrested and Dad breaking him out of jail? How could Dad? He's the sheriff. What deputies did he leave there guarding Ezra?"
Pat glanced at Sally doubtfully. She sighed and nodded.
"Go ahead and tell him all about it, Pete. He'll worry the life out of me until he finds out, and it ain't anything for him to be ashamed of."
"No, it sure ain't," agreed Pete warmly. "Just another time when Pat Stevens proved that he was smarter than all the rest of us put together." He took a big gulp of hot coffee and folded a slice of ham into a buttered biscuit and told the entire tale to the excited boy across the table from him.
"I wonder where Pat took Ezra,"
Sally mused while Pete had finished.
"He didn't tell me anything about what he was planning to do when he rode away last night."
"Well, he probably didn't want you worrying," Pete guessed. "I reckon he hid Ezra out until things quiet down. Don't you worry about them 2. And Sally inwardly resolved that she wouldn't. Not ever again. She couldn't help being proud of Pat's bold action in releasing Ezra from jail. It was just like him, she thought, to carry out such a plan without any help and without involving anyone else, not even Sam Salone. She knew Pat had kept Sam out of it for Kitty's sake. Kitty wasn't in any condition to be worrying about her husband being mixed up with any illegality or danger, and Pat had spared her that worry by going ahead without Sam's help. Doc went out with the men after breakfast to ride with them at their work that day, and Sally cleaned up the breakfast dishes and went on calmly about her self-appointed tasks for the day. All the time, she was thinking about Pat, with a little swell of pride in her breast and a fierce resolution not to worry about him no more. It was nearly noon, and Sally was out in the yard feeding cracked corns to her hens when she saw a deputization of armed men approaching the ranch house. Her heart came up into her throat for a moment because she thought it must be Harlow's men looking for Pat to arrest him for last night's jailbreak, but her fears subsided when she recognized the men. There was only 4 of them, all ranchers whom she knew well, that were solid and respected citizens of the valley. Mr. Simpson and Nate Turner were in the lead, and behind them rode young Pike Gilroy and Arnold Potter. She tossed the rest of the corn to the clucking hens and walked to meet them, tilting her sun-buttoned head, and smiled to let them all see that she wasn't worried about Pat. Nate Turner reined his horse up and lifted his hat to Sally. His grizzled face was quite grave. "Mornin', Miss Stevens," he greeted her. "Pat round about here anywhere?"
"No, he isn't."
Sally clasped her hands in front of hers and waited. All 4 men were heavily armed and looked serious. She thought things must have come to some sort of a showdown between Eustace Arlo and the other element in the valley, and that these men were seeking Pat for leadership in this new crisis, as they always had in the past. "I reckon Ezra's not here either?" Turner asked.
"No."
"We're wondering if you know anything about Pat breaking Ezra out of jail last night."
"Why, yes," Sally said gladly. "Wasn't it wonderful the way he worked it? He came home for his guns first, and I haven't seen either of them since. But I'm not worried about them. I know those two can take care of themselves.
Nobody knows for sure that it was Pat who got him out, Nate Turner explained carefully while the others sat on their horses and listened and watched her.
Well, who else do you think would have the nerve to do a thing like that?
Sally demanded proudly. Turner shifted in his saddle and glanced back uneasily at the others. He muttered, "Yes, ma'am, that's the way it looked to us too, but it seemed like a good idea to make sure to not go off half-cocked."
What are you talking about?
Sally's voice became sharp.
You act like you blame Pat for doing it. What else would you expect him to do, leave Ezra in jail? Do you think he would really knuckle down to a man like Mr. Harlow?
No, ma'am. I reckon that was mighty like Pat Stevens, all right. But it sure makes things mighty dang bad.
What are you talking about? Sally interrupted him fiercely. Why does that make things bad? Do you think it would have been better if Pat let Ezra rot in jail?
It would have been better for Ethan and Nancy Page and Jake Morton and Miss Kincaid,
Pike Gilroy blurted out bitterly from his saddle behind Nate Turner. Sally closed her eyes for a moment. She didn't know what he meant. She opened them slowly and echoed in complete bewilderment.
The Pages and Jake Morton and Miss Kincaid? What have they got to do with all this?
Plenty, said Turner heavily. We hate like thunder to tell you, Miss Stevens, but I reckon you better hear it from Pat's friends than somebody else. It sure looks like Ezra done went plumb crazy and murdered all four of them in cold blood last night after Pat turned him loose from jail.
Sally reeled from the shocking impact of his words, and she cried out,
"Oh, no!"
and put both hands to her face.
"Not Ezra! There's some terrible mistake. There must be."
"I'm afraid there ain't," said Turner grimly. "There's witnesses to every one of the killings, and I ain't saying anybody would believe the 6-year-old Page boy, and maybe not yet Jose that heard old Jake saying it was Ezra while he was dying, but there's the Kincaid boy, too. He seen Ezra just like the rest of them. All of them added together, they spell out that Ezra sure as you're alive."
"They saw Ezra do it?"
"That's right."
"But where was Pat when this was happening? Even if Ezra went crazy somehow, what was Pat doing?"
"Well, that's what we was hoping you would tell us, ma'am."
Nate Turner's voice had suddenly gone very gentle.
You don't think Nobody thinks Pat was there or had something to do with it, do you?"
Sally cried hysterically.
"Well, he turned Ezra out of jail, and it sort of seems like he'd make him responsible for Ezra." "You see, ma'am," said Turner apologetically, "all of us know that Ezra ain't none too bright, and I reckon there's a lot of folks been thinking that maybe he might go off like this someday, but we all sort of trusted Pat to hold him down. There was such good friends and all." "We're wasting time here," put in Pike Gilroy angrily. "We gotta locate Ezra before he sneaks up behind somebody else and kills them."
Turner said gruffly, "We're mighty sorry, Miss Stevens. If Pat was to find Ezra and put him out of the way first, I reckon it'd be the best all the way around. That'd sort of keep folks from blaming him so much." He wheeled his horse about, and the four men galloped away. Sally stood very still with the sun in her face and watched them go. She was too numb by the terrible news to really understand its full import. She only knew that Pat was in dreadful trouble, and that she could do nothing to help him. Nothing. End of chapter 11.